So when you still have fish spawning, but the majority of your fish start going into a post spawn, it's a really interesting dynamic for this time of year. And, you know, I'm, or however you want to call it, the hamburger of the United States, top bun, the meat bottom bun. In Florida is basically excluded from the hamburger. I am middle patty, but and the reason why this makes sense when I use that analogy like that is what's happening on the top patty is very, very different than what's happening at the meat and what's happening at the bottom patty. So I think I'm going to start using that analogy a little bit more often. Are you the top bun? Are you the meat? Are you the bottom patty? But the reality is I often reference water temperature. So let's just go with water temperature here, Ray. So lately I've been fishing on the California Delta mostly. I live on a private lake. I'm actually sitting right out here at my boat dock. And I do fish a ton of the lakes in the Mother Lode, which is all that mountainy area outside the Central Valley here. And this stands true no matter where you go. This pattern that I'm going to explain to you guys, and this is intricate. If you're just getting started in bass fishing, this is really not for you. Go back to some of my beginner or my how-to videos. But this is really going to get you dialed in. If you're an experienced bass fisherman that just can't figure it out when these fish start getting funky or just coming off of beds, or they are bedding and you go out and it's a storm or it's too windy, these patterns I'm going to explain to you will help you catch fish in those scenarios because it can be extremely tricky. So let's go back a couple of weeks ago, and the water temperature I'm talking about is 69 to 74 degrees. And what happens during this water temperature is you still have bass bedding, but you have a lot of bass in the post spawn, and then you have bass in the post spawn funk. I'm not going to say that's early summer. I'm going to call that the post spawn funk. It's like one of those transitional times where bass kind of shut down. You know, if you live at the meat, a lot of the time, post spawn funk happens in June, into May, early June, depending on how it is outside. And that post spawn funk typically shows up around 73 to 74 degree water temperature. I know this is getting very, very advanced, but trust me, this is going to help you. So let's go back a couple of weeks ago. I went out, it was a rainy day, it was storming. I was bouncing around the California Delta, and this works on lakes too. The best way I could say if you want to look for drastic temperature changes on a lake is if you're fishing a deep area, or you go to a really shallow flat area, or you go to a creek channel that has running. That's going to be your different areas. Or you go to an area of the lake that's typically dirtier, is going to warm faster, versus clear water is going to warm later. So that's how you bounce around a lake to find these water temperatures. And this is critical during this near end of spawn, post spawn funk phase that we're talking about. So a couple weeks ago, I go out and it's raining, and I start throwing underspin with a swim bait 4.8 Pro Swimmer on there, and I'm bouncing it around through post spawn areas. I get a couple strikes. They're smaller fish, but the wind's picking up. It's about 18 to 20 miles an hour. So bed fishing is pretty much out of the realm of things. So how do I call an audible for this situation? The water temperature was 69 degrees. It was a cold snap 2 nights in a row. It was probably a little bit warmer, but this is where you really got to pay attention to this water temperature and what you're going to be looking for right here. So I pulled around in a protected area, and I seen like a 3-pound female on a bed and like a 1-pound buck. Pretty standard on the California Delta. There's a lot of that during the spawn. So as I start looking around and I see that, I go, this is not going to work. Sure, I could catch that female if I wanted to. Yeah, nah, I'm not going to do it, okay? Just leaving it alone, because I know that's not going to be the pattern, because it's going to get so windy, everything's going to be blown out, and I am not going to be able to find bedding fish. So I'm setting myself up for failure at that point. So my second audible that I called was looking for slightly warmer water. So I moved further up this river system where they weren't releasing flows, so I knew the water was going to be warmer. As I ventured back in, there's a lot more shallow area, so that water is going to warm up a little bit faster. So as I went up, I was actually looking for bass fry. That's all those little juvenile hatched bass, and they roam around in fry balls, and you'll typically see a male sitting with them, protecting them. I'm not targeting the male, although in a tournament situation, sometimes it's very valuable to get a couple hot males, but they're the ones protecting the babies, and they're also the smaller ones. I prefer to target the big females, but when those males are around guarding fry and you can find heavy cover or boat docks near that area or big shade pockets, you're also in an area where there should be a very active female. When the male bass is still guarding fry in that area, the female just entered the post spawn, just entered, and that's like a feeding phase, very similar to a pre-spawn bass phase. She's stocking up to spawn, loading up, and then she's starving after the spawn. She's been through something else and she wants to feed back up heavy. And if it's a shallow body of water, you can fish shallow. If it's a deeper body of water that doesn't have heavy cover, big shade lines, those fish are going to move deeper, and target that however you will. But this is all about the pattern and how I went about finding them. I did not find any bass fry. I didn't. So my third option is find water that was 70 degrees or above. And the reason for this, I don't know if you guys watch my stories on Instagram or Facebook, a lot of people actually DM me when I started saying this out loud in my clips about bluegill beds. I was looking for bedding bluegill, which typically starts around 70 degrees. So when I found those bedding bluegill, I also know that the bass are going to be near them in the heaviest cover possible and buried in, nose looking up. I ended up catching like 22, 23 pounds that day. About 20 pounds has been winning every Delta tournament lately. So I knew it was a really good bag. I knew I was on the right fish. I don't really fish tournaments anymore, but I could see like, hey, this is winning fish right now on the Delta. So I knew that pattern was really good. And I know that's not how other people are catching them. So I started throwing my tough toad, the Savage Gear tough toad that I throw a lot, up into the dirt, literally casting and hitting the soil. And this is something me and my buddy Rex talk about all the time, is when they're nosed in, you hit the dirt. The reason for this, that commotion on the dirt gets their attention. It doesn't splash, it doesn't spook them. The moment you enter those bluegill beds on low tide on the Delta, and you'll see it on lakes too, they're dirt shallow a lot of the time. Dirt shallow. In those bass, the second that toad hits the water, they want to get it. I've also had this same pattern work at Comanche remarkably well with a popper. New Malones, I catch them on a popper doing this pattern. It's cleaner water. Sometimes the bluegill beds will be a few foot deep and the bass will be a little bit more leery. So you have to use something more natural with like a feathered tail on it. So just like a nice pop-bar with upgraded hooks and a feather on the backs. Fantastic for this. Now, that's how I ended up catching them that day on the bluegill beds. So I went back out 3 days later, and it's been warming up since then. I ran out to a similar area. I still knew I had those fish up there, but I look around a lot. I bounce around a lot on the Delta this time of year to see what else kind of fits the criteria of what I'm looking for. I'm looking for water clarity, and this area I was catching them in had about 4 foot of visibility, almost 5 foot of visibility, which oftentimes on the Delta is too much. You want about 3, 3.5, 4 max. Otherwise, the fish become a little bit more analytical. And I'll even talk about that. I made another post exactly about that very thing. So this few days later, it was slick calm, no wind. All right. So this is a new dynamic. And I can see where there is bedfish. But then in the afternoon, it started getting to about 7, 8 miles an hour, and it was on a big flat that I was fishing with heavy grass. I probably could have went in and targeted bedfish, but I really wanted to throw a topwater frog. I wanted to catch them my way. So in this story I posted, and I'll post the catch by itself on my Instagram. I'll post the catch and then do these talking point videos. But people heard me talking to my buddy John, JV, in the boat with me, about hesitate when you see just a little bit of a tiny swirl. It could be just this little subtle movement. If your brain tells you you've seen something when you're working a toad over an area where there's potentially bluegill beds, that could be the bluegill coming up to look at your toad. But oftentimes when there's a female bass next to the male, whether they're bedding or whether they're post spawn, they get crazy analytical and they analyze your top water thoroughly before they eat it. So they're going to come up real fast under it and stop. So oftentimes you'll see this weird water movement. And I said, stop it and just twitch it a couple times and give it a few seconds, almost like a popper. Boop, you let it sit, same difference. I could have used a popper in this situation, exactly the same as how I used my tough toad. But I twitched it, stopped, and I caught one. I believe it was just under 6 pounds. I didn't even weigh it. I've caught enough of them, but great, great fish. All right. And that was from stopping when there was a fish on a bed. So same principle. All right. So even if you go out and you're fishing at a time that they could be bedding, and you know they are bedding in that area, and you're throwing a toad or a popper from long range, if you think you see any sort of movement, do not leave that strike zone. Just stop, slow down completely. And if they don't eat your topwater at that point, follow it up with like a wacky worm or a Texas rig weightless Senko or a wacky trick worm or something down those lines, a big bite finesse worm, all work really, really well. So I had that going and I caught a few, had a good bag going, but then I ran back into another area where I thought there might be post-spawn fish. I was on the trolling motor for probably 30 minutes, 35, 40 minutes even maybe, and I didn't see any of the signs I was looking for. I didn't see bedfish. And I kept going. I was looking for fry. I kept going. I was looking for bluegill beds. Hauling butt down a weed line. Next thing you know, I seen fry. I stopped right there. I didn't throw at the fry. I threw my toad up to the bank. Bam! I catch like a 3 3/4 pound female. I went into the area where I found active post-spawn fish. And that little trick right there put me back on them. And as I was catching them, I noticed up on the bank, I seen some bluegill swirling around again. So I re-threw out there. I ended up with 19.5 pounds on that day, but this is strictly looking for signs. So I couldn't catch bedfish because it was too windy one day. The second day out, I could have easily targeted bedfish, but I didn't need to. They were still bedding. The females that came up to eat my toad, that was still a bedfish. I let her go right away. On the third trip, those were post-spawn fish. So those ones I was catching, they were done. So then, prime example, I go out yesterday and I decide to run up north and look around and see how that bite is. I bounce all around the delta to figure out where I can duplicate these patterns. I don't overpressure my spots in case I want to do film work in those areas. So I run up north, bad sign right away. The water looked tannic. It was only about 1.5 feet visibility in the spots I wanted to fish, even worse than that. From the areas that I launched and ran around all the northern area, and the water was 74 degrees. So I'm like, okay, I think these ones are going to be in a post-spawn funk. So I went to look for fry, too dirty. I couldn't see the fry. Threw the toad a little bit, caught like a nice 3-pounder. Tried to force the toad on other good-looking stuff. They just weren't up there. They were in that funk phase. So then I decided to flip Elodea mats. That's that weed on the delta because it was progressing towards low tide, forces the fish off the bank into those Elodea mats. So I was flipping, hooked one about 6 pounds, came off at the trolling motor. Good sign. Fished that for 2 more hours, caught a couple more dinks. I'm like, nope, I just lucked into a good run right there. That was a low probability of running into more big ones there. So what I did is ran to the best areas, channel swings, current breaks that had good current, where the fish that are going to enter early summer phases coming out of post-spawn funk, they like a little bit more current and they like heavier cover and they like to be on more vertical stuff. Travis behind me, Rex, he caught a 4-pounder on an underspin, great fish. But then we tried to replicate that and it was still very difficult to get around. So even though we still caught a pretty decent bag, the day was a grind because that area had fish in that post-spawn funk. I had a bad sign with that dirtier water and that overly warm water temperature. So I will be back in that area in about a month to target early summer fish. So you can see this is how my thought process is working. This is very analytical. Hopefully you take away some from this, guys. I'm Nick, the Informative Fisherman. I appreciate you watching.